Hello YouTube, Dave here again. A couple days ago I made a video sort of reminiscing on 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I mainly made that video because I wanted to sort of set the record straight because I felt like I was a bit unfair to it during my initial retrospective. But I really enjoyed just kind of sitting and talking very casually about that, the experiences that I had with 2nd edition. So I thought it'd be kind of fun to sort of continue that trend with the other editions that I have first-hand experience playing. And so without any further ado, I guess today, if you can't tell already, I'm looking to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition. And when I say 3rd edition, I actually mean 3.0. 3.5 is it is different enough, and my experiences with it were different enough that I feel it should be its own separate video. So I really want to talk about some of my early impressions of 3rd edition and some of the stories that I kind of have around it in terms of both things that I experienced as a player and even some things that I had done as a dungeon master, if they come to mind. So with 3rd edition, I was a very early adopter. It released in the summer of 2000. And it was the player's handbook that released initially on its own, which for anyone who's started with 5th edition, you would understand what that was like if you started from the very beginning. So the player's handbook came out first, and then I think it was a couple months later they released the Dungeon Master's Guide, and then the Monster Manual I think was the month after that. So what was really cool is that the first player's handbook actually had in the back of it a section for like a mini monster manual and a mini dungeon master's guide with some experience charts, some treasure charts, and some monsters that you could use until the other books came out, which was, again, it was just really sort of a cool idea. Instantly though, I felt like 3rd edition was the way of the future for D&D, because with 2nd edition, and again, I was really starting to kind of get more comfortable with 2nd edition at the time that 3rd edition came out, but I still found that the concept of the rule sets in the 3rd edition were just easier to teach beginners. So instead of having an armor class that the numbers decrease as you become better defended, or things along those lines, having the set everything increasing, like starting at a base number and increasing, I thought worked really well. I liked the saving throw system that they had introduced at the time. So instead of breaking it down by individual categories in terms of like petrification, polymorph, and then like poison, death magic, stuff like that, breath weapons and spells, rod, staffs, and wands I think were their own one as well. I just kind of like the idea of having the fortitude, reflex, and will saving throws. I thought it was a system that actually worked pretty well, and it made each, where they were able to be modified by the stats as well, I thought just, it was a better fit overall. And, the concept of you, for anything from skill checks to attack rolls to trying to make a saving throw against a spell, the idea that you are rolling a 20-sided dice, adding your bonuses, subtracting your penalties, and trying to equal or exceed a number, the numbers which increase the more difficult they are to overcome, was just a lot simpler. And I remember I just absolutely, pretty much instantly fell in love with 3rd edition. And I mean, even just looking at the books, like I loved the way that the core rule books looked, like the player's handbook, the fact that they made them look like actual sort of like, fantastic or medieval tomes, just really, really cool look. I like that they had extra classes in there that weren't in the player's handbook for 2nd edition AD&D, although honestly when it comes to the monk, there was never a class that I really liked. Because I just didn't feel that it fit the world that I would run. Like I just liked that Western European style of fantasy, and the monk never sat well with me. But I loved the barbarian, which actually led me to my very first character. So when a buddy of mine actually picked up the player's handbook, and I think he got it like a release day, he called me up and asked if I wanted to come over and make a character. And I was like, sure. I was really interested in what this new edition had to offer. So we get there, I start looking through, and I was instantly drawn to two of the things that were new to me, because again, I was rooted in 2nd edition AD&D, and that was the half-orc race and the barbarian class. So the very first character I ever made was a half-orc barbarian. I loved the idea of raging. I just thought, it was just a really cool character, a really cool class in my opinion. And barbarian is still a class that I really do enjoy to this day, although it's sort of been replaced as my favorite. And so I went out and bought the books myself, and what was really cool about the first release of the 3rd edition books is they were selling them actually pretty cheap. So these books, all 3 of these ones here, were $32 each after taxes, which was pretty good, considering that after the second printing and forward they would be closer to like $45 or $50. So it was just a really easy sort of price point to get into, and I started kind of poring over the pages, and I continued to run my own 2nd edition campaign for probably a few months after 3rd came out. But I found that I just kept wanting to go back and just, reference things in the 3rd edition books, because I thought that the 3rd edition books were just more, I thought the way that they handled the rule set was more internally consistent and logical, and I was really starting to like that. So I ended up eventually converting my 2nd edition campaign over to a 3rd edition one. The only thing that was kind of unfortunate about it is I was looking to set up an adventure where the player characters were going up against this beholder cult, and the 2nd edition AD&D Monsters Manual had tons of beholders in it, which was awesome, including things like was it the Great Hive Mother, I think it is. I can't remember the exact name, completely just escaped my mind there, but basically like the beholder that commands other beholders. There was I think it was the Hive Mother or the Great Mother. But anyway, it was just, there were tons and tons of beholders in there. They're like overseers that were like these fleshy tree-looking things that could also exert influence over other beholders. You had like the spectators, which I always thought were pretty cool. You had just all kinds of really cool beholders, and that was the storyline that I was actually starting to set up. And it was honestly one of the first storylines that I had really put a lot of thought into, but I ended up having to kind of scrap it, because when the 3rd edition book came out, the only beholder that they had in it was the standard beholder. So they didn't have any of the other beholder kin. They didn't have the Hive Mother. They didn't have anything else. So it was just like, at that point, it just didn't feel like it was going to work. And I realized that a few months, well, not a few months, but probably about a month or so before I actually made the switch. So I kind of started looking at other storylines that I could start that I'd be able to more easily transition into. And I honestly can't remember what I started with. I do remember that the campaign didn't last very long, because I was bringing the characters in at just too high a level, and this was all new to us. So like the characters were, I think, 9th or 10th level in 2nd edition AD&D. So it was one of those things where making them the same levels in 3rd, most of us were playing really for the first time. It just didn't work. So I honestly can't remember what that story was that I was pursuing, but it definitely fell apart. But the first character that I played, I really kind of thoroughly enjoyed. I had a lot of fun playing my barbarian, and there's a couple of stories that I remember with that first character pretty fondly, or pretty, maybe not necessarily fondly, but accurately anyway, because keep in mind, this was like 18 years ago at this point. So as I get older, I find that my memory is just not as good as it used to be, and it wasn't really great to begin with. But I remember one of the first, we were going through this dungeon, and another one of the players was actually playing a half-orc barbarian as well. And we were in this dungeon. There was this pedestal with this gem kind of floating above it. And the gem was something that we had to retrieve. It was some sort of magical MacGuffin. I can't remember what it was supposed to do, or what the properties it reportedly had, or anything like that, or why we were even looking for it in the first place. But I do remember there was like this gem on this pedestal, and everyone was worried that the pedestal was trapped. So everyone was arguing about what to do. The player playing a rogue, I think, rolled horribly low on their skill check, and they just wasn't confident. So I was actually sitting on a couch next to the other player playing a barbarian, and the space that we were in, there were actually a few couches kind of scattered about this room. And one of the other players, who, if you're watching this, I'm sure you'll probably remember this, he was playing a gnome wizard, I believe it was. And as everyone was sort of just trying to figure out what to do, this other player and I, who were both half-orcs, we just kind of, quietly said to each other, it's like, well, why don't we just throw one of the characters at the pedestal? And, if it sets off a trap, then hopefully they'll be, the momentum will knock them away from it. So we decided that the most likely character to throw, or the easiest one to throw, was going to be this gnome. So we both picked him up, like one arm, like we had basically one hand under, an arm on each side of him, flanked him, just grabbed him, and one hand under his arm, the other kind of grabbing by his belt, and we just, he tried to resist. To his credit, he tried to get out, but trying to squirm out of the grips of two half-orc barbarians with high strength just wasn't going to happen for him. So we ended up just launching him at this pedestal, and he was pretty mad. He did not like that very much. But we got the gem, and I think what happened was he was, thrown clear of where the trap was going to go off, so he was fine. But then later on, we came across this pit, and we just, for the life of us, we could not jump across this pit. Not that it was a huge pit, but we were just, for whatever reason, we just couldn't roll high enough. And the pit was about, I think, 20 or 30 feet deep. So every time one of us would try to jump it, we would end up, just falling down and taking some damage. Eventually, we got the bright idea to tie a rope to one of us and try it. But role-playing a character of low intelligence, I didn't let them finish tying the rope before I started to run. And, I made the jump check. Well, I didn't make the jump check. I failed the jump check, fell down again, took a bunch of damage. The player playing the gnome started laughing at me for being stupid, which, my character was. I think he had like a 7 intelligence or something like that. He took it. It was definitely my dumb stat for this barbarian. So we decided the only way to get over this pit was to launch the gnome, and we did it again. So we threw him across. He cleared the pit, and then we threw a rope over to him, and it was kind of the go-to joke for a while. If we were stuck on something, was to throw the gnome at it, and I just remember that was a lot of fun. It was a pretty fond memory with that character. One of the other ones that I remember was we were trying to infiltrate this Orc Camp, and the Dungeon Master had this, and he's a great guy, but I think he was one of those people who, when he sets out a puzzle, or even like something where there needs to be like some choices or strategy, he seems to be really married to the one way that he comes up with to solve it. And I remember we were supposed to sneak through, and so there was a couple of us playing half-orcs. I think there was actually a third half-orc character in the bar. No, sorry, the thief had something that allowed him to change his appearance, so he could look like a half-orc. So that only left 2 characters that were not half-orcs at all. And we knew that this orc camp had orcs and half-orcs, and they were all, part of the same thing. So we ambushed one of these orc patrols, and we stole their uniforms, like their tabards and stuff, which had like their clan symbols and things like that on it. But the Dungeon Master seemed pretty intent on us sneaking through or into the camp by hiding in barrels. And I just remember, it's like, I thought it was a bad idea, because all it would take is someone to say, I need to look inside, see what you're bringing in, which is not an unreasonable thing to do. Even for like orcs or half-orcs, if someone's bringing, barrels of stuff in, they may want to look inside and see what's actually there. You also run the risk of, when the barrels are being unloaded, for example, of them being handled kind of rough, characters getting bumped around and then having to make some sort of stealth check to avoid not like giving themselves away. So it just seemed like one of those things where there were a lot of different ways that could have failed. We had scouted up the camp enough that we knew there was like this prisoner's pen sort of near the middle of the complex. Not complex, but near the middle of like their camp. And the prisoner pen wasn't closely guarded. So a couple of us, and I don't want to give myself credit, but I'm pretty sure I was the one who first suggested that we just pose as members of this warband. So we, like I said, that we ambushed, we took the uniforms, and we snuck our way in. But we had prisoners with us. We took the other two characters as prisoners. And, we told them that this had to be as legit as possible. Because if we take, these two guys in, and they look perfectly healthy, like they didn't even put up a fight, it might set off some red flags. We also decided that we were not going to trick tie their binds, just in case they end up being inspected or another orc insists on taking them to the pen. So we're just trying to think of all the different ways that the DM could throw a wrench in the works there. So it's like, I'm really sorry, but we're gonna have to beat you guys down. And I was kind of a jerk because I didn't actually say that until we had already tied their hands. And so they didn't have much of a choice, but it was all subdual damage. They all got it back. It wasn't something that was going to, permanently or, affect them or put them at a disadvantage, because we were going to be in this slave pen for a little bit. Or in this camp for a little bit before we were able to, kind of launch our plan to take out this orc leader. So we ended up having to lay the beat down on our own party members. But it worked because, when we dragged a couple of like bruised and bloodied humanoids, like a human and a gnome, it was pretty believable. So yes, I believe it was another orc that took them to the prisoners' pens. And again, they weren't terribly closely guarded, so we were able to, after a night or so, they were able to rest up and get their, remove all their subdual damage. And then we ended up springing the trap. So we found a way to break them out without anyone noticing. We found the tent where this orc leader was, and it was a pretty cool. It was a pretty cool moment because the thief in the party was using or had access to a greatsword. And I don't know how he got it, but he took the feat for it and everything. I think it was probably his human feat that he had taken. But he had this greatsword, and we found the orc leader's camp, so the two actual genuine half-orcs went in to sort of distract the leader, while our thief character kind of circled around the back of the tent, listening for the voices to locate where, the leader was. And I'll never forget the image of, and there was a little bit of an argument that went on, but ultimately the player playing the rogue won out. Because he made some pretty good listen checks and other checks along those lines that he was forced to make to pinpoint exactly where the character was. And we also had like the lights in the tent that would cast the shadow and everything else. So he was able to figure out where this orc leader was. And so I'll never forget the image of this great sword tearing through the fabric of this tent. And sneak attacking directly into the back of this orc leader, dealing tons of damage. And he rolled, I want to say he even rolled a nat 20 on top of it all. So he basically one-shotted this boss character. And the DM was not happy about that at all, because I think obviously he put some time into designing this guy, and I think he got taken out in like a single hit, and then we kind of jumped his other two minions that were in there as well, and then we were able to escape. So that was, again, kind of a neat story. But there were also some other stories that, they were memories that should have been a lot more fun than they ended up being. And I had mentioned a couple times before that we had started the idea of running an evil campaign, like with evil characters. And we didn't do a very good job of being evil at this point in time at all, because everything was being presented to us like, we were basically heroes. and we just had a different, letters on our character sheet for alignments. But I remember one player was playing a blackguard, and he had the ability to rebuke undead and basically put them under his command. So we went up against this group of ghouls, and he ended up rebuking the last remaining one. And the player was dead set on trying to get the cursed item known as the Bag of Devouring, and the DM was just having none of it. So he's like, you know what, that's fine. We have a wagon. I have this large burlap sack. He rebuked this ghoul. So we put the ghoul in a bag, and that was his Bag of Devouring. And I remember after, fights that we would have, we fought this band of dwarves at one point, and one of them was right near the bag where the ghoul was, and the player playing the blackguard had named the ghoul Mr. Munchie. And I just remember, we knocked this dwarf down. He was unconscious and bleeding out, but he landed right near this burlap sack. So all of a sudden, this ghoul just shoots out of the sack. His upper torso just shoots out, hands out, grabs the dwarf, drags him back in, and starts devouring the corpse. And after that, we would just, basically use Mr. Munchie to dispose of any of the things that we fought along the way. Of course, one of the players in the group really didn't like the idea of having this ghoul, and I think he eventually ended up either setting him free or killing him or something like that. It was kind of a shame, because it was one of the things that was actually genuinely fun about that campaign, and it was something that the DM was actually okay with and sort of in on, and would do things like that to have, again, just make it a little bit more fun. The rest of the campaign itself really wasn't necessarily that great. I remember for this one I was playing a human fighter. And one of the things that had happened is, this one character playing the blackguard kind of got a lot of preferential treatment for for a couple of campaigns. His character kind of drove the narrative for several of them, and we were starting to get a little bit frustrated with that, because it felt like it was really favoring this one person. So eventually we just asked, why is it that, we're always following this one character around? Why can't we do something that isn't directly tied to whatever his goals are? And he said, well, he was the only one that submitted a background. And it's like, okay, well, you never really said you were looking for backgrounds. So, I wrote one up. And this was actually, I should rewind a little bit, because this conversation happened before the blackguard was a blackguard. He was still a paladin at this point. And but he was pretty close to, he was on his way to falling and becoming a blackguard. I think it happened 2 sessions later. And then, of course, that led to the Mr. Munchie scenario as well. But, so I remember he wanted this background. So I wrote a background about, my character, and basically his village was destroyed by this evil cleric. And this evil cleric, he was a human cleric, but his bodyguards were these 2 minotaurs. And, they basically wiped out the village, left him for dead, but he was able to, he pulled through and kind of sought revenge on these creatures now. Wanted to get, all 3 of them, the minotaurs and the cleric, and avenge his village. And then the campaign started to turn evil. And it sucked, because I didn't really want to go down that road. But at the same time, it's like, well, what else are we going to do? Even though I submitted this background, we're still clearly, going after whatever, this one player was interested in, or his storyline. So we eventually all just sort of gave in and switched the alignments in our character sheets. None of us were in a class that needed a good alignment other than the paladin, who fell and became a blackguard. So, but we were in this one town, and I remember that the DM actually had one of those minotaurs there, and he stated that he was one that was one of the ones that was from my background, because in the background I had mentioned that I, in trying to defend, the character's family, he cleaved one of the Minotaur's horns off. And he said, this Minotaur is missing a horn exactly where you would cut off the one from, your background. So I was like, well, now, I think I was only I think I was 6th level, because I do remember I had 2 attacks at this point. I just gained 2 attacks. And I realized I was screwed, but it was my background, so I challenged this Minotaur to a one-on-one fight. And I told everybody else to stay out of the battle. You know, it didn't concern them, and no matter what happened, not to interfere. And I mean, even though I was technically an evil character at this point, I still played it the way that I wanted to play the initial character. And so I remember I ended up I won the initiative, and I charged the barbarian, or charged the Minotaur, which was a Minotaur barbarian. And so I charge in, and I make my 1 attack roll, and I roll a chance for a critical. So in 3rd edition, your weapons had critical threat ranges, and so if you rolled the number, like, so for example, a greatsword had a critical threat range of 19 to 20. So if I rolled the dice roll, the d20 roll, and it was 19 or 20, it was a chance for a critical. And what I did, it would have to have hit with my regular attack bonus, but what I would do at that point is you would roll a second roll, d20 roll, adding your attack bonus and any relevant modifiers, and if you would have hit, if your number would hit, so if the opponent had an armor class of say 16 and you get a total of 16 on the dice, then you confirm the critical and you do whatever the modifier is, the multiplier. So for my greatsword it was ×2, so I would roll 4d6, and I would add my strength modifier twice. So I ended up actually critting him on the first hit, and it was really, really impressive. And the Minotaur went into a rage, laid into me with his attacks, and brought me down pretty low. So the next round, I got 2 more attacks. So the first attack was another critical hit, and the second attack was just a normal hit. But so I ended up again dealing a bunch of damage to this Minotaur barbarian, and then he hit me again with both of his attacks, because I think he was way over leveled, or at least had a massive attack bonus. But anyway, so he hit me pretty easily, did again a ton of damage. He knocked me down to I want to say I think it was either 3 or 4 hit points left. So the next round was my last round. So the first attack roll that I roll in that 3rd round was a miss, and that sucked. And I was like, well, that's it, here, blaze of glory time. And I rolled another natural 20. So I actually critted on him a 3rd time in that fight with 1 regular hit. Now the regular hit, I actually rolled max damage. So I ended up obliterating this Minotaur, and I was down to I was single-digit hit points for sure. It was less than 5. And so anything else I wanted to attack, I was screwed. And this is when the allies of that Minotaur decided that they were going to launch an attack. So I had to kind of try to hide for the rest of the fight, because I was just done. The next hit would have killed me, but the rest of the party took out the other combatants, which was fine because I had my fight, I had my moment, and I was really proud. I was actually, going to go over after everything was all said and done, and I was going to collect the Minotaur's horn. The first thing I did, though, is I had the Minotaur's blood on my sword blade. So I basically found a way to sort of scrape the blood off into this small vial, and I kept the Minotaur's blood with me. It was going to be basically a trophy, but what I wanted to do after that was I was going to take his other horn, and I was going to present it to the next one, to show him that I avenged, I got part of my revenge. And so I had the blood on my sword, which was real, but I go over to collect my trophy, and all of a sudden my hands just pass through the body of the Minotaur. And that's when the DM told me that, well, no, it was an illusion that was there. The body's gone. Basically what had happened was he realized, and he even said this before he had the body disappear, was that he forgot to make his attack of opportunity for the Minotaur's reach when I charged. And he said that, if that were the case, the Minotaur should have won. So then the way it was explained was basically, well, the Minotaur wasn't actually dead. He was just bleeding out and dying, but his body was teleported away and replaced with this illusion. And it's just like, I remember being really, at that point I gave up trying to pursue my background, and I think I actually retired that character. and made another one after that, because it's just like, I submitted this background idea, and against all odds, I won a fight that by all rights I should have lost. I rolled crazy high for like the first and probably last time in my life. And I was just so proud of that accomplishment. Like when I defeated that Minotaur, it was a huge moment for me. I was like pumped, because again, it was just something that I shouldn't have been able to do. It was a great moment for me, and it was a great moment for the character. It was really this genuine blaze of glory kind of fight where, I shouldn't have won, but I did despite all odds. And then I was denied my trophy. I was denied the right to, claim something to prove that I had done it. And basically the DM's like, well, no, I forgot to do something. So I'm taking the body back, and he's going to be stabilized and still alive. And I was like, yeah, okay. So I ended up getting rid of that character after that. And I can't remember what I played for the next one, but I think that may have been when I played my first ranger, my first elven ranger, my first archer character. But I just remember, like, it was one of those things. It was just such an exhilarating moment, and it was just completely taken away because, again, the DM realized that he made a mistake, and rather than just saying, in the heat of the moment, the Minotaur, overconfident, just let me charge, which is what I would have said. It's just like, nope, I screwed up, so it's not a real victory, and just really, really kind of ticked me off after that. So those were some of like my playing experiences. I can't remember, honestly, I can't remember too many of my 3rd edition, like 3.0 campaigns, but there are a couple of stories that I do clearly remember, so I'll impart those before I go. So the first one, well, actually there's I guess 2 or 3 that I can really talk about. So when I first started running my 3rd edition campaign, one of the things that I do remember, like I said, I don't remember how I set it up, but the thing that I did is I had a world hopping adventure that I had planned out for 3rd edition. And the idea was that I wanted to try out a few different storylines or world types. So like one world that they went to was a nation that was completely ruled by dragons. Like metallic dragons ruled one continent, but chromatic dragons ruled another, and they were constantly at war. But it's just like, what would a dragon-ruled world be like? If they were the governing body, and how would they treat like the humanoids, and what humanoids would live with which of the dragons, kind of thing. And to sort of push things forward, I had created a creature that was basically in the same classification as the Tarrasque. So yeah, okay, no, I remember what it was now. So yeah, so I love the Tarrasque monster. I always thought it was really cool, and I used it in a one-shot once, but that was kind of, cheap, and anyway, it was just a way to end the one-shot. But I liked the creature, and I liked the idea of how did it come into existence. So I had this very powerful lich that I created. His name was Elkar, and he's a villain. He's one of my villains that I dust off and bring out every once in a while. But he was, in my world, he was the first ever lich. And he was just he was bored. He wasn't really necessarily interested in, conquering the nation or kingdom or world or anything like that. He was just bored and experimented with stuff. And one of the things that he had created was the Tarrasque. And he decided that eventually, after several millennia of undeath, that he just simply wanted to see everything go away. And so he created the Tarrasque initially as part of that. But the Tarrasque was too bestial, it would just end up having to sleep for so long because of the amount of energy it would expend when it was awake, that it just wasn't feasible. Like, it would be like every 100 years it would emerge for, a couple of days kind of thing. So he created this other creature, and he simply named it Apocalypse. And it was this massive creature. I think he was about 50 feet tall, or maybe even more. He was able to increase and decrease its size, but It could grow up to, I think it was about 100 feet. He had ridiculous strength. He was basically going to be the campaign villain, and the players were hopping from plane to plane in order to try to escape it while finding something that they can use to defeat it. So every once in a while, after an adventure or two in one world, I would have this apocalypse creature emerge, because it was meant to be the multiverse killer kind of thing, and the players would have to escape. And so I remember one of the settings I wanted to try out was a low magic setting. So it was a setting that was more like just historical medieval Europe. There was arcane magic, so it's not like it didn't exist, but it was incredibly rare for anyone there to practice magic or be able to control magic or create magical items. So the characters were going to be, very different and very powerful, and I was the main story that I wanted to have was them, like how their magic would impact this world. And so they arrived in this kingdom, and the kingdom was attacked. It was under siege, and they sort of appeared in the middle of a courtyard, and were going to lend their aid. So at night, there was this night attack where the attackers breached the walls and made it into the keep itself. So it was a situation that was looking pretty grim. There was this army that was marching through getting deeper and deeper into this castle, and the player characters, the intention was that they were going to go and basically help defend this keep or this castle. And one of the players was playing a druid, and he decided to awaken this little sapling tree. So this little sapling tree came to life. I was like, that's fine, whatever. But then he's like, well, I've got all these other magic items from other adventures that I want to shape it to use, like wood shape or whatever the spell was, to give it a humanoid form. And the thing was about the size of a halfling. So he's like, he started putting magical equipment on it. And it's like, oh, dear Lord. But, at first it was okay, because it was just a couple of things that they were looking to put on it. But it ended up going longer and longer and longer. And for 2 hours, they were discussing what items that they were wanting to put on this tree, basically. Like a glove, a gauntlet of rust. And it was going to have like the little tree just run around and touch all the enemy's armor, so they would just fall apart and rust off. And at the same time, it's like at first they heard the sounds of the attack outside the walls, and then after a little bit, it's like, okay, so you hear this this loud cacophony of noise, and all of a sudden people are shouting that they've breached the walls. The part of the wall was taken down, and that they're flooding the courtyard, and it didn't break them from wanting to dress up this friggin' tree. So, eventually it's like, okay, well, you hear them saying that they've broken into the castle and that they're in the lower levels. And again, it's still in. So again, like over the course of 2 hours, they were just putting all this stupid equipment on this tree, like magical armor. They gave it like the gauntlet of rust. They gave it all these other things too. It was just absolutely insane, and which is one of the things that I think was maybe an issue with 3rd edition, was that it was very just based on some of their guidelines and the levels that they were at this point. It was very, very treasure, like magic item heavy in terms of what you would get for items. So anyway, they ended up doing all this, and I did have an enemy wizard in the group, but after 2 hours of this and completely ignoring what was going on, although a couple of the players were saying, okay, we really need to get to work defending this place, but it just wasn't working. So anyway, this little sapling comes around the corner, I nuke it with a fireball, and then I end the campaign. I was really burnt out at that point anyway, and just needed a break, and that was one of those things that kind of just pushed me over the edge. It's like, it's something, if they wanted to do it, that was fine, but to choose the middle of a major battle to spend that time, and basically because of their inactions, it led to the castle being breached. Like I had this whole thing planned out about how they could get to the walls, help defend the walls, and prevent anything from getting through. And the idea was that they would be able to repel, most of the attackers. But it just didn't happen because they were too busy, dressing up this tree in the middle of a fight. So just like, the thing gets hit with a fireball, the tree is absolutely obliterated. And then I just basically, rocks fall and everybody dies. And I ended up taking a break. I did come back a couple months later. I felt a little bit more refreshed. The DM who had stepped in the meantime, started up a new game. He wasn't really into it. Actually, I think we played Rifts in the meantime, if I recall correctly. But I was like, all right, I feel like I can start another campaign. So I had this one that I was going to do, and the first dungeon was supposed to be just a quick one-shot kind of thing to start off with, and then go from there. And the idea was that it was going to be pretty much, pretty much a no-combat dungeon that was just filled with traps. And the idea was just to get the players cooperating. Most of the traps had, in order to disarm them, required multiple people working together. And I just wanted to sort of try to bring the group together. And it didn't go so well. And I think I've told this story before, but basically they circumvented this pit trap. It was this, 30-foot deep spike pit trap that they ended up, they opened up the trap, but they, made it so that it wouldn't reset or anything, so that it was obvious where it was. Then the group had sort of split off, and one player decided he was going to go down this hallway by himself. And so he goes down this hallway, and the rest of the group was doing something else. And he comes to this door at the end of this. I think it was like a 50-foot. It was a 50-foot hallway, and there was this door at the end. And what happened was that, when he opens up this door, it was actually a fake door, and it triggered a trap when he opened it up. So what happened was the door that he came through to get into this hallway, the door itself slammed down, or slammed shut, and two portculli, one on either side of the door, came crashing down. And these things were pretty heavy. So the idea, and there was no way to reset them back into the wall. They would just permanently, if you lift them up and then let go, they would just come crashing back down. So again, the idea was that the characters would have to sort of work together to solve this problem. In the meantime, this hallway starts flooding, and it and it was a rapid flood. I think after 5 rounds, the hallway was completely filled. So the other characters, heard the slam, heard the portcullis come down, and they went to go investigate. So I had one player who was this, strong. I can't remember if he was a barbarian or if he was just a fighter, but he was using a spike chain. I remember that. And there was another strong character who was it was a barbarian, half-orc barbarian using a spike chain, and then there was a human fighter, and the human fighter decided that he was going to lift the portcullis up, and the thief in the party, the rogue in the party, wasn't able to pick the lock, or didn't want to pick the lock, or there was just something going on, I think, or he was in a different part of the dungeon. I can't remember exactly what he was doing to begin with, but so we had the one fighter holding up the portcullis, while the barbarian started smashing this door with his spike chain in order to break the door down, while the monk on the other side is having to hold his breath and hope he doesn't pass out. So, it's going well. They get about halfway through the door's hit points, when all of a sudden, the halfling thief, rogue, whatever you want to call him, decided that he wanted to play a prank on the other character. So he takes this rope and clandestinely ties it around the ankle of the fighter holding up the portcullis. And he said, basically as soon as the half-orc attacks, with his chain, he's going to, yank the rope, and Anyway, so what ended up happening was he yanked the rope. The player playing the fighter, who was concentrating solely on holding his portcullis up, he actually ended up, the halfling rolled high enough on his strength check that it actually yanked his foot out from underneath of him. He comes falling down flat on his face. The portcullis comes down. The portcullis catches the spike chain, and the half-orc barbarian is now furious. So the half-orc barbarian chases the halfling to this 30-foot spiked pit, and decides that he's had enough of them, and he, wants to initiate a grapple. And if anyone remembers grappling in 3rd edition, you'll probably know where I'm going with this. So grappling provokes an attack of opportunity. So in response to the grapple, the halfling decided that he wanted to just latch on to the half-orc and grapple him back. Now, I had already ruled that they would have to roll initiative, and whoever won initiative would get their action off first. And the attacks of opportunity would just cancel each other out. But both of them, it didn't stop either of them from arguing with one another, not with me, but with one another, for over an hour about who should get the first attack. And it may have been less than an hour, but it certainly felt like it was more than an hour. So, yeah, and in the meantime, nobody can now help the monk, because the only person who was really able to do damage to this iron door is preoccupied and arguing with this halfling. And I wasn't tracking like game time as real time as they were arguing, but finally what ended up happening was the halfling was able to do what he wanted. He won the initiative, so he jumps up and he grabs on and wraps himself around the half-orc barbarian's arm. The half-orc barbarian holds the halfling on his arm over top of the pit and just starts shaking his arm rigorously. Eventually, he causes the halfling to fall down into the pit. Halfling takes damage, he gets stabbed with a couple of spikes, is able to crawl his way back out, and the barbarian just says, nope, I'm standing at the edge of the pit, and every time he comes up, I'm going to knock him back down. And this went on for several rounds, until the halfling was finally dead. And in the meantime, the monk drowned. And it was just like, okay, I mean, all they had to do was just work together, for one dungeon, and that was something. I think I actually took a year off of running games after that point. I was just done. Like, that was just too much for me. Just trying to get these players to cooperate with one another, and they were so dysfunctional as a group that it just wasn't worth it. The last story, and the one that made me realize that I needed to convert to 3.5. There were two things that happened. It was in the same campaign, though. So this was the evil campaign that I was running, where the players had to discredit this, local hero, and basically make him look incompetent to make the Zentarum look stronger, because I was running it in the Forgotten Realms. So they had this, caravan that this hero was protecting, along with a bunch of high-level guards. Now, I'd spent quite a bit of time statting these guards out, planning their tactics, everything else. And the first round of combat, the player playing a druid, a different druid, but playing a druid, cast Creeping Doom, and just dropped it right in the middle of all these guards, killing them instantly, because there was 1,000 points of damage just dropped right on them in this area. And it wiped them out. Like, one of them had a spell called Fortunate Fate cast on him, and what that is that if he was reduced to below 0 hit points, it would instantly cast the heal spell like a contingency. And so basically he, was just devoured by these insects, re-healed, and then devoured again. And it was just like, wow, that really kind of cheapened the fight quite a bit. And it was a very, very broken spell. So then in another fight later on, I created these 2 dragons. And again, I'd spent quite a bit of time statting these dragons out. And if you ever statted dragons out in 3rd edition, you know that it can take a little bit of time. But, I put all this work and all this effort into these dragons, and the mage in the party ended up casting a combination of spells that was absolutely ridiculous. He cast Iron Body and Tensor's Transformation. Now, at the time, I didn't realize that the two spells were actually designed in such a way that you could not cast them both at the same time. But I didn't realize it at the time, and this was a really broken combination because what Iron Body did is, I think it gave like really, really high damage reduction that these dragons just couldn't get through. And then Tensor's Transformation turned this mage into this, absolutely brutal fighter type of thing. Now, as it turns out, to cast Tensor's Transformation, you have to drink a potion of strength, and Iron Body prevents you from being able to ingest things. It just, you're not able to swallow. So if I would have known that, then it would have been a little bit different, but they absolutely manhandled that mage on his own manhandled those dragons. And that's kind of where I learned that these were 15th or 16th level characters that I started at. And this is where I realized that 3.5 could get, or third edition could get pretty unbalanced at higher levels. And then there were other fights that kind of bothered me a little bit as well, because you had 3.0 haste where you got a second action. So your spellcaster, if you had the quicken spell prepared, a spellcaster using 3.0 haste could cast 3 spells around, which at lower levels it balances itself out because you run out of spells really quickly. And that can be bad. But at higher levels, you have a ton of spells, including spells that you can quicken. Lower level spells that you can quicken for higher level slots. And you just had so many spells that, again, every combat, it was just as soon as he got a chance to go, he would just nuke everything. And it started to be a lot of, I felt like I had to start designing encounters to get around the abilities of the player characters, and once I started doing that, I felt like I was being a confrontational DM, and that's not the kind of game that I want to run. So I took some time off then and started running 3.5. So, that said, there were some fun memories. I really enjoyed the Mr. Munchie thing. I loved the stories with, flinging the gnome at pedestals or over pits whenever we were stuck. And I enjoyed some of the adventures that I was able to run, but it was just it came down to the group. It really did, because with 3.5 I eventually did find another group to start playing with, and things went a lot better at that point. But anyway, those are some of my experiences with 3.0 third edition. Let me know in the comments below, what are some of your guys' early experiences with third edition? And again, I'm limiting this to 3.0 because I do want to do a 3.5 video. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. I got a pretty good response from my second edition one, so this might become sort of a semi-regular thing that I do, and I enjoy it because, again, this is sort of my opportunity to just talk D&D with the viewers, and it was kind of what I decided I wanted my channel to be in the first place, was just a way to continue to talk about my hobby or the thing that I enjoyed when I wasn't able to really play it. So like I said, I like doing these kinds of videos. Hopefully you're enjoying them, and if you want me to do more of these, then please let me know, because I'm having a lot of fun just again traveling back down memory lane. Anyway, again, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you next time. Take care.